We live in an era of profound change, where technological, political, and social shifts intensify daily. How can we navigate these pressures while driving the transition to sustainability? Currents in Sustainability is a podcast by the Stockholm Environment Institute, where we examine the forces shaping our global path towards a sustainable future. Drawing on insights across our 8 research centres, we explore key foresights on issues underpinning transformative change. In this episode, we explore how pressures on land are taking on new urgency. We'll discuss the fears and hopes around land conversion, degradation, and restoration, and how these shape our work. The episode is hosted by Toby Gardner, Senior Research Fellow at SEI and Co-Director of TRACE, an initiative promoting transparency in deforestation and agricultural commodity trade.
So a very warm welcome and thank you for joining us in SEI's Ground for Change podcast series, where we're trying to bring a fresh and honest take on some of the most profound sustainability challenges of our time. Today, our focus is on land and the multifaceted ways humans depend on land-based resources, whether it be food or timber or minerals, but also how the extraction of those resources has degraded the very ecosystems on which we so vitally depend, and the myriad inspiring initiatives seeking to protect and restore land for people, but also for climate and for nature. Our objective today is to host a conversation with 4 experts on this topic, a conversation that draws on their expertise, but also gives space to their personal experiences and emotional connections to the degradation and restoration of land where they work. This is not an Ask the Expert type panel discussion, but a chance for an honest dialogue that recognizes the world is changing fast, nobody has all the answers, and all of us and all of our views are shaped profoundly by our own personal experiences. I will give each of our guests the chance to introduce themselves in their own words, but I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast series all 3 of our guests today, and they are Irene Suárez Pérez, who's speaking to us from her home in New York. And Irene has a vast experience working on international climate negotiations and championing nature-based solutions at all scales. Mónica Trujillo, who's at SEI's Latin America Center in Bogotá. Mónica is an economist who's worked on sustainable agriculture and protected areas management across Latin America. And Selorm Kugbega, who's here with me in SEI HQ in Stockholm. And Selorm is a human geographer who's worked in depth on structural economic change in agricultural development, with a particular focus in Africa. And without further ado, let's jump in. And I'd like to start by giving each of my guests a chance to speak as to why land is important to them, personally and professionally, and in their work and in their perspective, why and where and how is land becoming more important. And maybe we could start with you, Irene.
Thank you so much, Toby, and a huge thanks to SEI for preparing this podcast and to you for moderating and your leadership. I love that question. It's a very grounding one, and I believe that land is central to who we are, and in my case, land is very, very important because it's a very central piece to what provides me peace. So it constantly helps me get perspective. Land helps me in grounding and reminds me of the possibility of regeneration. So throughout life, land has provided that. And it's also a wonderful way of reminding myself that we are nature and that we're just one small piece of Mother Nature. So that's a bit of land for me. To your second part of that question, I also believe that land is central to our development as individuals, as part of landscape, as part of provinces, countries, regions, and the planet. And I've had the experience of working on the nexus of poverty and development, conservation and development, and climate change, which I believe is development. And land has been central in all of that. So I'll bring that a bit to life through the story of my country, of Costa Rica. And I believe Costa Rica is one small sample of showing that we can reverse trends of these high demands that we all have on land. And Costa Rica was in the 70s hit a peak of having deforestation rate of 4% per year. And that took us to the reality of having only 21% of forest covered nationwide. And today, we have over 50% of our country covered by forest, and we're very close to achieving the 30 by 30 target of protecting 30% of our land surface, and also working hardly on restoration. So it just demonstrates that we can reverse land conversion with many elements behind that, of course. So strong institutional arrangements that enforce the law that was passed in my country that forbids land use change, including legions of guardians, kicking off with, of course, indigenous peoples, but also forestry regions, civil society committees like the Covirenas, of which I'm also a part of, and financial mechanisms, the famous payment for ecosystem services. In our case, we tax carbon. And we've, with all these elements and others, we've been able to decouple economic growth and from land conversion. Of course, this isn't a done deal, of course not. And we're actually seeing that at risk. There's fragility of institutions, given new political interest, and we obviously need the renewed political will, as all countries do. So I just close saying that land is central to development and to our well-being. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you so much, Irene. The truth that you bring home, that we are nature, is indeed so grounding. And whilst we can be lost in international discourse and big initiatives, we can, of course, always remind ourselves that we are part of this interconnected web upon which we so depend. And thank you so much for sharing those reflections. And Mónica, maybe you could unpack a little bit from your side what land means to you, and where and why and how in your work it's becoming more important.
Thank you, Toby. I am so honored to be part of this conversation. I was born in Bogotá, Colombia. And as a Colombian and as a Latin American, for me, land is nature, is life. Land means biodiversity and supports all social diversity and all economic development. So I think my vision is influenced by different visions of different communities that coexist in this country. So more than half of Colombia, my country, is covered by forest, and including different ecosystems. There are more than 300 different types of ecosystems due to its geographical richness. There are indigenous people with more than 60 ancestral languages that they speak today. And for example, it's very common to hear from indigenous Andean communities the vision of Mother Earth, or Pachamama, which is a goddess that sustains all life. There are also Afro-descendant communities that are recognized as traditional and small farmers or peasant communities with their own vision of land. What I am describing about Colombia is similar to Ecuador, to Peru, to Bolivia, to Venezuela, to Guyana, to Brazil. So it is a larger region that connects the Andes with the Amazon. So that I want to refer to this region come from this part of the continent. So there are different values and visions of what land represents, and I am influenced by that. And those different visions and values still coexist, although the conventional economic model predominates, and unfortunately, it is destroying this diversity. So that's my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mónica. And last but not least, Selorm, maybe you could share with us what land means to you, and in your work, how it's becoming and why it's becoming more important over time.
Thanks, Toby. In terms of my relationship to land, I grew up in urban Accra, Ghana, but my parents always made sure we visited our native village in the Volta region of Ghana, which is in the southeastern part, at least twice or three times a year. It was almost a ritual that we had to do all the time. And besides being really occupied with my favorite pastime there in the village of chasing goats and chickens and sheep, I also started paying attention to how the local people conducted their livelihoods. And most of them were farmers that worked very hard, but had very little to show for it. And I found myself asking some questions about how these people could work so hard but remain quite poor. And this paradox stayed with me for a long time. And because of that, I've been intrigued by the question of how rural economic development occurs within these societies. And one of the first things that I noticed when thinking about rural economic transformation is the asset base of the community. And land is by far the most important economic asset for sustaining the livelihoods of these rural people in southwestern Ghana. Land is also treated as a spiritual entity by these people that is supposed to be used by the past, the present, and future generations. So there's a deep ingrained value where present users of the land know and understand that they have a duty to safeguard the resource to support the future subsistence of the next generations. And so when land is protected by the locals, they do so for their own livelihood today and for the sustenance of the future generations. And in Ghana, we do give a couple of accolades or names to land because of the provisioning capacity that it has. Among the Akan people in Ghana, they call land Asasiya. And Asasiya gives us sort of attributes of the provisioning services that we get from land, but also of its feminine nature, the ability to reproduce and support the subsistence of the local people. So for me, land means a little bit more than the economic gain and wealth creation that we get from it, or that many people talk about these days as a resource that you just extract from. It means the future economic trajectories of the local people, but it also means the spiritual meanings of provisioning and life that they attach to the land.
Thank you so much, Selorm. I think it's wonderful that you used to go back to your ancestral village a few times in a year, and I hope you keep that tradition going now that you're still based in the far north and the icy north of Europe.
I hope so. I plan to visit every time I'm in Ghana. I did when I was last in Ghana last year in March, so it was quite nice. I didn't chase the goats though, but I still visited the local people.
Wonderful. Well, what a wonderful start. So much richness, so much experience, but also depth of connection. And what we want to do now is, there's so much that we could talk about here, but it's helpful to connect the expertise that you all have, but also your personal experiences, by looking first at some of the challenges and some of the fears that you each have around the challenges facing us when it comes to the degradation of land and the exploitation of land resources. Not to doom monger, but to keep our heads firmly out of the sand and think about, well, what are some of the biggest barriers to change and how can we address them? And if we can reflect upon each of those fears in turn, and then we can move the conversation away from those fears to one of hope and optimism. But let's look first in this reality check of what are we, each of us, most fearful of and why when it comes to trajectories of land use by 2030. And again, maybe Irene, maybe you can kick us off in what's really driving you when it comes to your kind of real concerns.
Thanks. And it's this notion, this idea that limitless growth still exists. That is what is at the essence of my fear. So the fact that this notion that limitless growth still exists is really driving more land conversion, more degradation, more desertification. We see data of UNCCD just published that 40% of world's land is degraded. It's been affecting half of humanity and threatening half of global GDP. For those who are concerned about economic growth, and they should factor that in, but I'll get to that in a moment. Then on deforestation, we see annual losses now 2 million hectares of forest per year. And this is, of course, driven by multiple things, depending on which country, but agriculture is one key driving force. I'd highlight logging, infrastructure development, you name it. Now more rare minerals. And when one is looking at how this notion of limitless growth is at the backdrop of, I believe, elections in some G20 countries like Argentina or the United States, the narrative there of, continuing with this limitless extractive economies, I think that is basically at the heart of my concerns. And lastly, I'd highlight the fact that the incentives to pivot from extractive to regenerative exist, but sometimes I feel they're not growing at the pace that we need to really counterbalance that. So I'd wrap up there.
Yeah, or the scale, maybe. I think we're probably doing this the right way around by starting with the fears and then moving on to the hopes, because otherwise we'd all be left rather depressed. But Monica, to you, what are some of the biggest fears that drive the urgency in your work and facing the trajectories in land use degradation, restoration in the coming years?
Yes, thank you, Toby. Yeah, and I am absolutely in the side of what Irene was saying. I absolutely agree. And for me, it has to be with this economic model. But in detail, for me, the cancer that is affecting the Amazon and self-destroying this key ecosystem and different key ecosystems that are in the region is deforestation. Is, in my opinion, the most urgent concern. And we have lost more than 85 million hectares of this key ecosystem, and that is more than 30% of the original ecosystem in the Amazon biome. So deforestation brings fires, loss of biodiversity, irreversible damage to the ecosystem when coupled with climate change. So some examples of this deforestation include agriculture, cattle ranching, infrastructure construction as roads, mining of gold, cocaine production, among others. Deforestation is happening without control for many reasons, but one crucial reason is economic. There are other connected reasons such as cultural, political, and institutional reasons, but I would like to refer mainly to the economic problem. And I think the economic problem is that we have not managed to make the standing forest profitable or economically attractive, the standing natural forest. So today, illegal economies and unsustainable practices, as unsustainable agricultural practices, predominate in this wonderful region. So the problem with agriculture in the Amazon is that it copies or it follows models from other ecosystems or from other countries, such as monoculture with commodities, focusing only on one crop, such as soybean, such as cattle, palm oil, coffee, or so on. So agriculture in such diverse areas as tropical forest should copy characteristics of the forest and the local ecosystem, that is, diversity. So the key principle to follow is diversity. Farming and livestock systems should be diverse, as are the agricultural systems of the indigenous people.
Mm-hmm. People will be forgiven for having the impression that deforestation is relentless and relentlessly high, and rates globally do remain stubbornly high. But maybe just pushing back a little on your fear, maybe it's good for our listeners to know that there has also been success in reducing deforestation, particularly in your own country, right? Between 2022, 2023, deforestation in Colombia dropped by some estimates by approximately half, which is mind-blowing.
Yes, but still there are high rates of deforestation. So yes, it's like a small victory, but the problem is so huge that you have to continue working. And it's a continuously work and enforcement of laws, regulatory, and of course, trying to change economic system is, I think that's the key.
Thanks. Well, that was my attempt to introduce a small chink of light early in the despair, but your point is well made. Selorm, maybe you could share with us a little bit from your perspective. You spoke to this in part, being rooted in communities who work so hard yet remain so impoverished. But unpack a little more, if you would, on where the real fears are that drive your own concerns and your own work on land.
I would like to highlight two major fears that mainly concern competition between land users. The first one is the pursuit of economic development by some African countries, no matter the consequences. And that is linked to what Monica and Irene have mentioned about the challenge of limitless growth. So for Africa, many African countries, including Ethiopia and Tanzania to an extent, operate what is known as the developmental state model, which grants the state uncontested power to lead economic development. And the consensus among many development economists is that Africa's comparative advantage for development lies in the abundance of its land resources, rather than in labor, which was the case in Southeast Asia, if you think about the 4 Asian tigers. So for purposes of ensuring economic growth, African developmental states in the past 30, 40, or 50 years or so have engaged in large-scale land appropriation, that is taking the land from locals and dispossessing them from the land and giving it out to international corporations for foreign direct investments in commercial agriculture, industrialization, or other land uses. This same economic development motive was used to justify land grabbing in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial and food crisis, and during the biofuel boom period, where biofuel was viewed as the sort of new source of energy that was going to replace fossil fuels and good for the climate. And in these instances, land was sought for food production to feed rich but land-poor countries, developed countries, and secondly, for the production of biofuel feedstocks such as sugarcane, oil palm, and jatropha. At the time, the media reported, for example, how Chinese companies have acquired over 2.8 million hectares in the DRC for oil palm production. And one of the main land grabbing issues that broke the news in the media was how Daewoo Logistics, a South Korean company, leased 1.3 million hectares of land in Madagascar for maize production.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're seeing a new angle of contract-based or proxy land grabs. For example, in Tanzania in 2023, the president announced availability of 690,000 hectares of mostly forcibly acquired land for block farming, where farmers produce specific crops on contract for agribusiness companies. With this new approach, Longpeng, a Chinese company, has pledged to invest over $200 million to improve soybean production and exports from Tanzania because they're interested in having better control of their supply chain. This new contract-based model of land grabs that you see, for example, with this Chinese company, means that hundreds and thousands of hectares of land are dedicated to specific commodities that are going to be bought by this company. And the farmers have no right to vary their production. They just have to keep on producing that same crop no matter what. And so millions of people have been displaced through this process of taking land away from the locals and seeing it as, marginal and underutilized. And so we have to bring investment to those lands by sending it to foreign corporations. And the heavy-handedness of the state and the private actors within this process has led to the weakening of what would be the traditional customary institutions that protect land assets for the local communities. The second thing I'd like to highlight is green grabbing. And that is basically the latest stage of land grabbing, where the land is taken from locals for climate and environmentally positive investments, such as carbon forestry and renewable energy investments. So at its onset, green grabbing was basically seen as a small price to pay for the fixing of the climate crisis. But we know today that it has severe consequences for local livelihoods. At the moment, as we speak, like you mentioned earlier, Toby, 1 billion hectares of land, which is about 83% of the total crop land we have available now, is promised by states as part of their nationally determined contributions to halting the climate crisis. But we need to stop and think about where this land is going to come from. It's probably going to come from this so-called marginal land that other groups are sitting on. That supports the livelihood of farmers and pastoralists today. And keep in mind that lands are being degraded every day. The world will need more new lands that they're going to bring into cultivation for agriculture. But these lands, so-called marginal, are the ones that we are sort of promising for climate gains. So recently, what has happened also in terms of this green grabbing situation has been that 25 million hectares of land in 5 African countries has been granted to Blue Carbon, which is a company in the Gulf states, for carbon offsets for close to about 30 years. This sort of allocation makes up about 20% of the total land area of Zimbabwe, which is 7.5 million hectares. and 10% of the total land area of Liberia, including forests, not just marginal lands, dedicated to one company. And what we see is that this company is likely to sell these carbon credits to oil and gas companies in the Gulf states, in UAE, in Kuwait, in Qatar, and other Gulf states. So sort of carbon forestry projects seem to be good in a sense because you're trying to do the right thing for the climate, but it has given some license to unscrupulous groups of people to basically remove or expropriate people from their land.
Thank you, Selorm. I think what you've set out there, and it's a very bleak story that you portray, goes precisely against what each of you set out at the beginning in reflecting on what land means to each of you, which is that it's so much more than space. And your kind of blunt summary that Africa's greatest economic asset is seen often externally as being its land, not its labor, not its people, speaks directly to that. And as you say, the economic model cuts across all of your concerns. So I'd like to pivot our conversation if we can, and I'd like to keep with you, Selorm, because it's so, the picture that you've painted of state-led development in Africa is so visible in our minds. Maybe you could share a bit on the hope that you draw for positive changes in land use, land restoration, where you're working.
Thanks, Toby. As I see, the main challenge is competing land uses between different land use groups and also different land uses in essence. And I draw hope from the emergence of hybrid land management institutions where customary actors who have a duty of protecting the local people and their land rights have started working together with state institutions and state actors to safeguard the sort of land for the local people and making resources available for these farmers, even if they have to be removed or resettled in new places. And so the idea here is that we can improve or support the process of economic development without having to expropriate the local people. But we need to do that rightly through understanding their customer views of the land and bringing the state's views on how land should be used together and coming to a consensus. The other thing that I see that is positive is that there is increased interest in community and group-based land title registration at the statutory level. So before, we didn't have a lot of this. Land was registered individually. When the statutory process started, it was an individual privatization of land, but we're increasingly seeing a community-based sort of privatization of land, which is aligned somewhat with the customary protection of land. The final thing I'd like to mention is that there are some movements in the right direction in terms of reducing the dominant antagonistic narratives between different land uses. Maybe not so much between, industrialization and agriculture or forestry and mining. But we see, for instance, that the FAO has started a conversation in its recent Community for Forest and Community for Agriculture agenda in 2024, where they're talking about increasing the interactions between forest and agriculture, which have been viewed as primarily antagonistic agendas. So this is something in the right direction. I hope that it can move on to other land uses where we are creating a seamless relationship between different land uses rather than having what would be antagonistic views about land uses or antagonistic agendas about land uses, and that they can't exist with each other.
Sure. And FAO is the Food and Agricultural Organization, for those not familiar with that acronym. So Selorm, that last example, that's kind of big picture and global in nature. But, back to your early examples of where you're drawing hope around hybrid land systems, customary rights. Are there examples? You talk about going back to your own ancestral lands. Do you drive by examples that really remind you that some of these ideas are actually grounded in places and people? Maybe you could tell us about one or two.
There is something that has been established in what is the Ashanti region of Ghana now, known as a Customary Land Secretariat, which is basically a secretariat that sits under the chief or the king of the region, known as the Asante Hene. He is one of the most powerful monarchs when it comes to West Africa and maybe even across the world. And he has set up a secretariat for the management of the land resources. Remember that these chiefs also obtain part of their power from the lands that they administer. And so the Customary Land Secretariat has, some interactions with the state land management agency, so that if anybody wanted to have access to land, they'll have to interact with that secretariat first and understand the values of the local people, and also commit the customary rights of the people and sort of the best protection and the needs that are required in order to access that kind of land before then moving on to the state system. What this has created mainly is to remove the logic or the thinking that land can be bought totally, because it does not exist within customary system.
Thank you. Now that gives it a bit more color. And then, of course, the challenge is how to replicate, scale, emulate such experiences. And maybe you can help us in that, Monica. Now we've turned the page more to optimism and hope of where you draw your own sources of inspiration from in your work.
Yes, Toby, thank you. And my hope comes from the momentum of the bioeconomy worldwide, from the recognition of the bioeconomy as a strategy for delivering solutions to the triple global crisis of biodiversity loss, climate change, and land degradation. And by bioeconomy, I mean an economic model based on the sustainable use of biodiversity, agriculture, forestry, and organic waste, and some more bioresources. This model is disruptive because it aims to replace the fossil economy and the unsustainable economy with high value-added bioproducts resulting from available knowledge, science, technology, and innovation under principles of sustainability. That's a very important part. So the bioeconomy is not a perfect model, it's under construction, and we have to construct that model to our context. So nowadays, more than 7 countries in Latin America have launched their bioeconomy strategies and policies at different levels and sectors. So there's a great dynamism in the region and in the world with this model. So recently at COP16, the bioeconomy was recognized as the model to follow for the Amazon, and several countries already included in their biodiversity action plans. So ATCO, the Amazon Treaty Organization, is also designing the bioeconomy strategy for the Amazon beyond. So we are at an important moment of coordination and collective action. So that gives me hope.
Thank you so much, Monica. I mean, maybe we turn to you, Irene. I know that you've worked on both mandated international environmental agreements, but also voluntary agreements, increasingly amongst non-state actors, both of which can provide hope and despair. But, where is it that you're drawing your own inspiration and hope from in your work?
Thank you, Toby. So first, I'll just say I draw hope again from this more spiritual belief that there is an awakening that's happening, that we are more aware that we are nature, that we should care for nature. And this awareness of the impacts that we all see in our countries, that we see on the news, raises to the forefront the fact that inaction can take us to even worse situations. And that concern really fuels the importance and the opportunity that we have at our fingertips of taking action and transformation, because we can transform. And so that hope, that awakening, is twinned with the fact that there is an abundance of regenerative possibilities for us to take action on. And specifically on land use and agriculture, isn't it wonderful to know that agriculture and land use right now is an important source of emissions that fuels these impacts, but it can be the most important sink of emissions. And it is the source of resilience, and it is a source of well-being. So, keeping that in the context, that's something that really is a background of my hope. I'll give you examples of movements, initiatives, and technologies to scale that I've seen on the government side and also non-state actors. We got 196 governments deciding that halting and reversing deforestation and degradation by 2030 is central. We also have the highlights that multi-sectoral solutions, including the protection, restoration of ecosystems, but also sustainable agriculture and resilient food systems, was there, decided by the 196 governments. So this is relevant because it's input for all governments to take into account as they enhance their national climate plans and put it on the table precisely this year as we head into COP30 in Belém, Brazil. So I draw hope on that opportunity, twinned by the global biodiversity framework of the CBD, where it was adopted that we must reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. Let me go to the non-state actors more at large, and key movements, initiatives, and technologies that fuel my hope. First, I'll kick off with data, tools, and geospatial platforms. It's amazing to see how much data we have at our fingertips, the tools that we have, the geospatial platforms that can facilitate the transformation in land use and agriculture, that to which our governments have committed to publicly. And we have tools like Encore, focusing on biodiversity, Trace, Forest IQ, which builds on Trace, Forest Watch, Restor, these tools. It's impressive the amount of information that is available to us all. The truth of the matter is that there is no excuse of inaction, of no business or financial institution, particularly those which have such a strong forest, land use, and agriculture businesses and investments in those. So that's one area of hope. The second area is the growth of transparency and the widespread adoption of TCFD, now ISSB, and also the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD being that of climate. And we see this growth of regulation around the world and growth of climate and nature reporting. And we need to encourage that because we also see a backlash, an anti-ESG movement occurring. But we need to help counterbalance that, and we have the power to do that. And I believe the growth of transparency facilitates the land use transformation and the accountability and allows the alignment of financial flows to sustainable practices to occur. A third area in terms of non-state actors is the fact that non-state actors should be presenting and implementing nature strategies and climate transition plans. So there are 11,000 non-state actors, including businesses, financial institutions, and cities from 116 countries committed to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So we need to be seeing how financial institutions are including deforestation within their climate transition plans. We want to be seeing adoption of deforestation policies across financial institutions. And now going to our role as civil society, when we go to the bank, instead of only asking about our accounts, it's also asking about how they have a deforestation policy and how they're implementing that.
Thank you so much, Irene. And our listeners can't see, but it's not just the words that you come with, and each of you, but the way in which you deliver them that conveys this passion and conveys the genuine sense of optimism and hope that I see in all of you in the examples that you bring. And I can see our fellow guests nodding along to a lot of what each of you are saying. So let's fast forward a quick fire round, if you will, and wrap this up for our listeners to have a sense of what success, genuine success, would look like. It can be one idea or two, but genuine success that would look like for you in really scaling and accelerating these sources of hope by 2030. And maybe, Monica, we could start with you.
Okay, Toby, thank you. So success consists on moving very quickly to change the business as usual for new economic strategies in these ecosystems that are both rich and fragile at the same time. Success is about making standing forest and biodiversity sustainable business models more profitable or preferred than other alternatives, such as a single commodity monoculture like cattle, ranching, or mining. That implies transforming business as usual supply chains into value chains with sustainability agreements that generate employment, income for local communities, broadening the vision of business with multiple sources of income and value addition that benefit local communities and territories. And finally, we need to change the way we measure success or aspirations. This scalability may not be as important in these ecosystems as diversity or scope are.
Selorm, what does success look like to you in 2030?
I just want to pick a bit up on Monica's point about the scale we're using for the measurements, which I think is very important. The scale of capitalist economic growth is quite problematic in my view. And recently the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, released a report on the true cost of food, where we're being told that whatever we're buying in terms of food fixed by the capitalist system and the price mechanism is actually not the true cost, because there's so many environmental and social concerns and risks that are taken when producing the food, but are not accounted in the price. So it's very important, and nice that you mentioned that, Monica. In terms of how I see success, I like this question because it gives us all an opportunity to dream and construct what would be some future visions. And at the risk of sounding maybe too optimistic, I have three visions. First one is a world where indigenous groups are not marginalized or treated as passive participants in development. Instead, they are viewed as key actors and beneficiaries of large-scale investments. So they sit side by side with these large-scale economic development interventions. Number two is a world where vulnerable groups are not sacrificed and viewed as a small price to pay for fixing the climate crisis. Here we have this large climate crisis. Everybody's going to be affected. The world needs a solution. Why don't we sacrifice these poor groups? I don't think that is a good way to go. We need to find a better way. We need to find a better balance regarding this. So instead of that, I think that environmental objectives should be balanced with livelihood concerns as well. And the final thing is that we need to create a landscape where multiple land uses can coexist. This antagonistic views between land uses is something that we need to move away from. We need to have future visions where forests are sitting next to agricultural landscapes and forests are sitting next to mining landscapes without it being too disruptive. But on this point, I'd like to mention that SEI, together with the Food and Agriculture Organization, Conservation International, and the Nature Conservancy, are leading a report that is doing exactly this, gathering the scientific evidence of the benefits of forests to agriculture and trying to challenge these long-held normative opinions about the sort of antagonistic views or agendas that exist between certain land uses, in this case, forests and agriculture.
Thank you, Selorm. And last but not least, Irene, share with us what your vision of success looks like in 5 years.
Success would be that we have mainstreamed and internalized the narrative of opportunity, that we have successfully depolarized the climate narrative, that we all have understood the political messages and we have market signals that are embraced by all sides because simply it makes sense for all in the present, in the medium, and in the long term as well.
Thank you so much, Irene. Well, we're at time. How to possibly wrap this up? I think what we've demonstrated is that we are not lacking information, we're not lacking perspective, and we've seen that it's not enough to just have the statistics and the numbers. We need to ground our understanding of what needs to be done in human experience that brings it back to the role and the impacts on each of us, no matter where we live. And I think that the way that you packaged it at the end, Irene, was really a North Star for all of us, which is to mainstream the narrative of opportunity. And if we can depolarize debates, as difficult a sentence as that is to say, in the face of some of the political winds that we see sweeping across the world in so many countries, holding on to that depolarization, having honest discussion, sharing experiences, and providing access to the incredible rich resources that you all and so many people out there are working on, then we can hopefully indeed mainstream that narrative of opportunity. And I'll leave it with that and thank each of you for joining us and looking forward to the next edition of SEI's Ground for Change.
Thank you for listening to Currents in Sustainability, a podcast by Stockholm Environment Institute, where we explore how various forces shape our global path towards a sustainable future. Subscribe to be notified when new episodes are available in this series. To find out more about these topics, guests, or our work, please visit sei.org.